Okay, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, I guess, and welcome to our fifth webinar in this series. Today, we'll be talking about how employers can lead their workforce in the new normal. As a bit of an introduction to the Poirier Group, we're a Toronto-based boutique management consulting firm founded in 2005, focused on strategy execution, operational efficiency, and creating cultural alignment. We partner with clients across diverse industries to provide them with custom sustainable solutions that transform and improve their business. We're currently in an interesting climate where we're merging into a new normal, where businesses are leading workforces in conditions that require specific actions and leadership strategies. Before we begin, next slide, Hazel, please. Before we begin, we would like to thank the Association for Corporate Growth for being a promotional partner, as well as the Institute of Industrial Engineering for their continued industry support. We've hosted previous webinars with both of these organizations, the recordings of which will be available on our website and may provide additional context for what we'll be talking about today. This webinar will be recorded and a copy of it will be sent to you in an email. There is also a PDF version of this webinar available in the handout section in the bottom right drop-down menu. You can download it before this live webinar is over, or you can contact me after the webinar and I can send it to you directly. We welcome questions throughout this session. Please type them in the chat window and we will be able to answer them as time permits. Any other questions or comments can also be sent to us after the webinar. And then I'll introduce our panelists in the next slide. So today we have David Poirier, who is the founder and CEO of the Poirier Group. David is a dynamic and visionary leader who brings considerable experience from senior executive roles in the retail, general merchandise, food distribution, health and life sciences, and manufacturing industry sectors. He creates operational strategies, business transformations, and process improvements that positively impact organizations. David thrives at running multiple global divisions in complex and ever-changing business environments and affecting positive cultural shifts that impact the bottom line performance. I'll now turn it over to David to introduce our two panelists.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the fifth TPG webinar. We're excited to introduce you to, first of all, Hazel Claxton. Hazel retired as Executive Vice President and Chief Human Resource Officer for Morneau Shepell in 2018. She was previously with PwC for over 25 years in a variety of leadership roles, including Human Capital Leader, the Chair of PwC's Women in Leadership Initiative, and Corporate Restructuring Group Partner, an area that she practiced in for 20 years, working closely with companies in financial difficulty and their stakeholders. Currently, she's an active board member for Unity Health Toronto, the third largest hospital network in Toronto, a very challenging environment right now, and the University Pension Plan and Queen's University. And she has a reputation as a courageous and collaborative and authentic leader. And I have the pleasure of having known Hazel for quite a number of years and been able to work with her. Demetra is a business professional with over 10 years of experience in legal affairs, financial compliance, and business administration. She possesses strong relationship and team building skills developed through dispute resolution training and leadership coordination roles. Demetra has a real passion for healthy living, and following her MBA, she became certified. Demetra currently sits on two boards at the University of Toronto, and we're delighted to have Demetra as a member of the TPG team. Let's move on now to the webinar.
Okay, it's Hazel. Thank you, David, for that kind introduction. And yes, David and I had the opportunity to work together for a number of years when I was at Morneau Shepell. So delighted to be here and part of this webinar. David, just maybe a technical thing. When you were talking, there was a little bit of breaking up. So if you and Maggie can both mute, that would be great so we can ensure the best sound quality for everyone.
Sure.
So the storyline for today. what we're looking to cover. So today we're first going to set the scene by looking at what is commonly being described as the new normal, or the new normal, or the next normal, but not the past. Next, we'll look at the workforce we're leading and their needs. We're going to follow that by some key areas for leaders to be focused on. Then we'll bring it all together at the end. I'm going to lead. You're going to be hearing from me for the most part, and Demetra and David will jump in from time to time. And we look forward to addressing your questions as time permits towards the end, and we'll strive to leave enough time for those questions. So pre the pandemic, and before we get into the new normal, we need to recognize that there was much that was already in play that was impacting employees and the workforce. The most significant of these trends was the impact that rapid advances in technologies were having on shaping the workforce and the work that employees were doing. Technologies such as artificial intelligence, autonomous vehicles, the Internet of Things were already drastically altering how individuals, companies, and governments operate, leading to massive transformation. There are many charts out there, and you'll see an example of one of them on the left, which tries to capture which roles that are out there, which jobs will be the most impacted by autonomy, which roles could be reduced to an algorithm and not require people in those roles. So that was already giving rise to a lot of concern on the part of employees. What roles could technology do versus humans? What skills were required to support these massive shifts? And where did that leave the workers of today? Would they participate in the workforce of tomorrow? And you can see in the top graphic reference to, in the fourth industrial revolution, today you will be completely irrelevant if you're not keeping up. And in the bottom, you'll see this is a survey from Edelman, the 2020 Trust Barometer. And you can see there that 83% of employees were already concerned about losing their jobs due to one or more of these causes. And I know it's small, and hopefully you can read it, and you can certainly read it when you get the handout. Automation is the second from the bottom, so it was just one of the causes for concern. Freelancing, the looming recession, the lack of training and skills, and we'll come back to that later on, immigrants who work for less, and jobs moved to other countries. And we'll talk more about a lot of these things as we go through the webinar, but all of this to say that employees were already very concerned about their jobs. For companies that were already wrestling with transformation brought about by the fourth industrial revolution and the implications of that for their bottom line, they were also being called upon to focus on a higher purpose, not just profits. It started with a focus on ESG. You've all heard of that, environmental, social, and governance. And particularly focusing on social, that encapsulates how companies treated their employees, health and safety, working conditions, and contributions that the companies made to the communities in which they were operating. I think it's fair to say, and for those of you who have awareness of your company's ESG efforts, for a long time, I think companies dabbled in ESG. But the focus on ESG, and in particular social, reached a new level a couple of years ago in 2018 when Larry Fink, who is CEO of BlackRock, the world's largest investment firm, wrote in his annual letter to CEOs that companies need to do more than just make profits. They need to contribute to society as well if they wanted to receive ongoing support from BlackRock. And that's relevant because if you don't have support from investment firms, then shareholders will take their money and put it in other companies. And then you lose, not lose, but your ability to operate and invest and grow is impaired. In 2019, on top of what Larry Fink said, the U.S. Business Roundtable organization, which is comprised of CEOs of U.S. leading companies, issued its statement on the purpose of a corporation. And you can see here that, again, it's emphasizing that it's not just profits. Each of our individual companies serves its own corporate purpose. We share a fundamental commitment to all of our stakeholders, and we commit to delivering value to our customers, investing in our employees, dealing fairly and ethically with our suppliers, supporting the communities in which we work, and, oh yes, generating long-term value for our shareholders. So these were all the pressures that companies were under in terms of not just profits, but purpose as well. On this next slide, we talk about trust, which is really important, particularly in these times of crisis and transformation. Up until this point in time, trust has been, unfortunately, on a downward slide. Trust in governments, institutions, companies was on the decline, as reflected by this 2020 Edelman Trust Barometer. And this was in spite of a strong global economy and near full employment. If you look closely, you'll see that the US was in the red, or is in the red, which is the distrust zone. And Canada, just above it at 53, is in the neutral zone. And both countries had declined over the prior year. Edelman says in its survey that the cause of this decline in people's trust is found in people's fears about the future and their role in it. So that same worry that we saw before is coming out even more clear here. I think it's fair to say that with government stepping in during the pandemic to shore up the economy and protect workers, at least for a time, trust levels may see some improvement. However, the pandemic is taking a massive toll on the economy and people's job security and financial security. So the cause of that distrust, that fear of the future, will likely be felt more deeply. It'll be interesting to see the survey results next year. Finally, the last of our pre-pandemic trends that I want to touch upon are changing demographics. With longer life expectancy, workers were already contemplating possibly needing to work longer to fund their retirements, and that will now be amplified. For a while, employers have been attempting to be responsive to the changing needs of the younger generation of workers, particularly for meaningful work and careers, and those workers wanting to work for companies who are active around ESG. On diversity, there are increasing numbers of women in the workforce, also greater ethnic diversity, largely as a result of immigration. And of course, in these days, more recently, we have everything that's going on with the anti-racism movement, in which people of all colors, races, and ages are participating. Companies have been striving to create inclusive workplaces for some time now. And as we go into talking about the workforce we're leading and their needs, we'll circle back on some of these demographic trends and how they should be informing how employers are leading their workforce in the new normal. So those are just a sample of things that were already going on pre-pandemic. And then, of course, the pandemic hit. As is captured in the quote on this slide, the pandemic has been a huge accelerant for transformations in the workforce and in the workplace. With the advances of technology, we've been talking about the future of work for the last 8 to 10 years. And pre-pandemic, we'd made some progress, but we still had a long way to go. With the pandemic, in a matter of days or weeks, things that we thought weren't possible have occurred, such as remote work at scale and virtual delivery of education. As David mentioned, I sit on the board of a large university here, or maybe not so large, Queen's University. And our principal has said to the board that 6 months ago, if you had asked him to oversee moving almost 100% of learning online, it would have taken 10 years to do that with all the committees that would have been formed. However, they were able to do that and a fairly decent job of it within just 2 weeks. So that just gives you an example of the speed of change. So the new normal is here to stay. And we are definitely living in more of a VUCA world with the uncertainty. One thing that's important to note is the new normal is not post-pandemic. What we're in right now and what we're going to be in for a while to come, this is the new normal, this level of uncertainty. It's going to be 12 to 18 months before we get a vaccine that will enable us to, go about somewhat freely our lives like we did before. And until then, business models are going to need to be evolved. People's health and safety is going to continue to be a priority. And so this is the new normal for the foreseeable future. And everything you see on this slide are the things that we do know for sure, notwithstanding the uncertainty. It's even more of a VUCA world, digital, more remote work, reshaped business models, and labor forces transitioned or transformed. So with this context, we're going to now turn to understanding the workforce that we're leading and their needs. I wanted to ground our conversation on leading the workforce in the new normal in some theory about what is likely impacting employees during these times, particularly from a psychological perspective. We're going to use the well-known Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And as Maslow would tell it, people spend most of their life trying to ascend this hierarchy. It's a long-term endeavor, and many may never reach the top of the hierarchy, self-actualization, reaching their full potential. As we just saw, pre-pandemic, already there were some employees struggling with aspects of this hierarchy around economic and financial security, relevance in terms of their skills and how they would participate in this fourth industrial revolution. So already some of these needs were being challenged. Along comes the pandemic, and you'll see here that we're depicting that individual who had spent all this time ascending the hierarchy, now sliding down. And the reason for that is that research has shown that when people's needs are no longer satisfied, they metaphorically slide down to the earliest levels on the hierarchy. The person depicted on this picture is between the physiological and safety needs. And I think that provides a fairly accurate picture of where a lot of people are these days. Everyone is worried about their physical health and safety, and many, particularly those who have been laid off or had their hours curtailed, are worried about their financial security. And remember the point I made just a short while ago about growing numbers of women and ethnically diverse people in the workforce. Or at least I think I made that point. Now, as I look at this, I'm not sure that I may have forgotten to mention it, but it is a fact. And as you no doubt have heard in the news, in this pandemic, women and people from diverse cultures are being disproportionately negatively impacted by the pandemic. So for them, their needs are likely ever more pressing than others. These needs that are captured in the hierarchy are being uniquely shaped by the pandemic. we're going to show you a different version. This is somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but if you look closely at the basic level, that physiological level, one thing you'll see is a Wi-Fi signal. And while we can chuckle about this, and no doubt each of us has experienced the challenges of not having a great signal, more seriously, think about employees working remotely who aren't able to efficiently connect to Wi-Fi to do their jobs. Or, as again, we've all heard about children of families who are challenged financially, who didn't have the technology required to keep up with their studies when all schools went online. So tongue-in-cheek, but really is looming large in the midst of this pandemic. And you'll see as you move towards the top, some other interesting depictions, including way at the top, people cutting their own bangs and dyeing their hair. It's a good thing we don't have video for this call. So the other thing that is very relevant, and much has been written about this during this pandemic, particularly in the early days, was that in many ways, what people are experiencing is grief. There are 5 stages of grief depicted on this graphic. And depending on the individual, people could be moving through these cycles from denial, acceptance, all the way through to, denial, anger, and all the way through to acceptance, particularly now that people are realizing that these conditions that we're living in could potentially go on for a while. So all of this to say that these are all things to keep in mind as you consider how best to support and lead your employees. So transitioning over to our next area, one thing that research has absolutely proven is that in times of crisis, leadership matters more than anything. So we're now going to turn next to that important topic. I've got a couple of quotes that I've kind of blended together. The first line, "The pandemic is the defining event of our lives," comes from a professor at Harvard Business School, Nancy Cohen. And in her words, "This pandemic is the defining event of our lives, of our generation, for now and for the foreseeable future." The second line is one that she references, and it's sort of a quote from Abraham Lincoln that brings to the fore how important what we do is now. And the full quote is, I'll read a little blurb, and he's saying this to Congress. This goes way back, 1862, a couple of months before the proclamation relating to the emancipation of slaves. So a defining moment in a generation. And what he said to Congress was, "Fellow citizens, we cannot escape history. We of this Congress and this administration will be remembered in spite of ourselves. No personal significance or insignificance can spare one or another of us. The fiery trial through which we pass will light us down in honor or dishonor to the latest generation." So what we do now, more than anything, matters hugely at this time of this pandemic, which is, for many of us, going to be the most significant thing that has happened in our lives. Leadership skills, let me just make sure I'm building this, have always been important. And if you think about what I said earlier in terms of all of those things that were happening pre-pandemic, leaders needed to be good with everything you see here on the left. But now, in times of crisis and transformation, leaders are called upon to do even more. I'm going to walk through a handful of things. Many of these will be well known to you, but I wanted to speak to them so that we can make sure they're at the forefront of your mind. So it goes without saying that the path forward is uncertain. We don't know what this is going to look like a year from now, or 2 years from now, or 5 years from now. And for businesses trying to navigate this uncertainty, there isn't necessarily a North Star, there isn't a destination, there's no 5-year strat plan that they're going to be confident in. So what leaders need to do now is be comfortable leading by navigating from point to point, ready to deal with whatever may come. Over the last number of years, we've all heard a lot about design thinking, that iterative thinking, testing, learning forward, pivoting where needed, repeating, failing fast. All of that terminology and all of those practices are hugely important now, because we don't know, like I said, where this is going to end up. Regular communication is key. People are anxious, they're uncertain, they're not grounded, and regular communication is really important. It brings stability, reduces fear, and it fosters empowerment if people understand the situation. And honesty about what's to come, the obstacles and the challenges it's really, really important. The last thing you want is for a leader in your organization to be pulling the wool over people's eyes or overstating things, not being brutally honest. It really, really matters now. At the same time, we have to give people reasons to hope. What are the resources available to us, including the intangibles of our resilience, our commitment, our values? What are those resources available to us to get us through? And no doubt you can draw upon similar challenges and scenarios that the company and the individual leaders have faced before. Framing the stakes for your team to align with the current situation. What do we know? What's predicted to lie ahead, as far ahead as you could see, which is likely not that far. Resources I just mentioned, and constantly framing and reframing the stakes helps people make sense of the crisis and understand their role and dial down that fear. Finally, taking care of yourself and one another, or one another and yourself. Really important to tap into the voice of your employees. Exhibiting empathy, compassion, vulnerability will engender trust. That trust that I said a few minutes ago was really being challenged, particularly at this time. And it's really important for leaders to take care of themselves and to role model that self-care, because your organization cannot afford to have you falter. And that is really important. I want to just maybe delve down a little bit more on the empathy. And if you all think of examples of leaders who, through this pandemic, have come across really well, these are the qualities that they have. If you think about Andrew Cuomo in New York, the regular frequency of his updates, the brutal honesty, the compassion that he demonstrated. In New Zealand, the Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern. Out west, Dr. Bonnie Henry, the medical officer of the province. Compassionate, honest, calm leaders who have really engendered trust in people. So the last thing I want to say on this slide is that leaders are made, not born. And one thing that Nancy Cohen from Harvard has said is that leaders are made more powerfully during periods of crisis. And there are periods of stability and periods of significant growth, but it's during periods of crisis that leaders can be made even better. And so leaders need support. They don't necessarily know how to do everything. And it is important, depending on the situation in a company, to reach out and get that support. And I know I'm not supposed to be making a pitch, David, for your organization, but in my time working with TPG, this is exactly the type of support that we received at Morneau Shepell for a division that was going through a massive transformation, and our leaders needed that coaching and guidance. The other thing I'll just note, and this is wearing my HR hat, when the time is right, as you look back, or even as you're in the midst of this, assess your leaders and identify those who have demonstrated the skills to best deliver your company's future. This is the best university. This is the best teaching. Experiential leading is the most effective. They'll need support, but do take this opportunity to really look at the leaders in your organization and identify those who have made a difference during this time. So we're going to move on to, so the point here, leadership matters. And matters in respect of what? What are some of the things that should be top of mind for leaders at this time? So we're going to go through some more basic buckets, but very important. So the first one is health and safety. Has definitely risen to the top. It's not a compliance matter. I mean, it is that, but now at a macro level, the entire global economy has been paused to protect the health of humanity. At a company level, an employer must take every precaution. I'm going to start building this slide here. Every precaution reasonable in the circumstances for the protection of their employees. And if employees believe that their workplace is not safe, they can refuse to return to work. And you're going to start to see, and even in the news today and in the paper, there were articles about this very point. We're seeing a number of refusals to work. However, it's very complex. And I'm going to bring up on the right-hand side here the guidance that's available under the Ontario Occupational Health Act. This is just one example. There'll be similar legislation in whatever jurisdiction you operate in. But you can see here the right to refuse work. Do all workers have the right to refuse unsafe work? What happens if a worker continues to refuse work? Do they get paid? So there's a whole bunch of things that are involved with returning your employees to work. And this is where HR teams working with legal counsel and the managers within the organization are hugely focused on working through all of these issues. And one of the things that people are coming to realize, and these are lawyers saying this, is that the existing legislation never really anticipated, a pandemic or a situation of this size. So it will be interesting to watch how the incidents, the cases unfold, and what the provincial regulators or parties who are involved in health and safety determine. So I know, Demetra, you've got some stats that you want to share with the group, and then Demetra will also turn to mental health. So I'll turn over to you, Demetra.
Thank you, Hazel. Mental health is definitely top of mind lately. Employees are experiencing increased stress levels with their added responsibilities at home, extended work days, and fears about their health and that of their loved ones. In April 2020, the Canadian Mental Health Association surveyed 1,001 Ontarians, and from that sample, 58% said they believe that their mental health has worsened as a result of the pandemic. 70% of the respondents said they worry about losing family members and friends to COVID. Earlier, we showed you the Kubler-Ross grief cycle. It's important to note that employees may have repeatedly experienced loss over the last few months and may not yet be able to name what they're feeling in order to ask for help. Over to you, Hazel.
Thanks, Demetra. So one last slide on health and safety, because like I said, this is probably the most significant area that organizations are focused on as they think about either returning their employees to work or forget about employees, or not forget about employees, but in addition to employees, creating the conditions in their organizations or in their places of business for customers and clients and others to come and be safely in the space. So health and safety is top of the list. Here's a couple of examples of the guidance, the measures that are out there, and it will depend on your type of business or sector. On the left, we have just a graphic that is showing various things that you can be thinking about. Elimination of incidences or interactions that give rise to possible transmission of the disease. And ones to think about there are having employees work from home, reconfiguring your space so that there is that physical distancing in your workspace, down to PPE. We've all come to know what PPE is. And so that's one example of an approach. Likely in places where you can have more of your employees work from home. On the right, in the forestry sector, where many of their employees would be required to be at work and not work from home, you can see again a number of different practices that are available to organizations to drive health and safety. At the end of the day, on this slide, the last point I want to make is that return to work is a big test of trust. Employees are looking at you, customers are looking at you to see if you are putting your money where your mouth is, when it comes to their safety. If you don't, then there are a number of risks. Staff retention and attraction. Is this the type of company that I want to work for if they don't value my safety, or if I'm considered to be, dispensable? Reputation and legal risk. And we can all think of companies that have been in the news where there have been outbreaks. Having outbreaks is probably fine, not fine, but was a natural thing to occur in certain circumstances. At the hospital, we certainly had them. But the real question is, what did the company do about it to eradicate it, to make things better? And people are watching, and this literally is a matter of life and death. And I don't think we've ever been in this situation before. So the next thing that we're going to move on to is remote work. And I think everybody would agree that remote work is here to stay. I know that it depends on what sector you're in, but we've seen a lot of it, and we've heard that a number of companies are going to continue with it going forward. You're seeing here on the graphic an office water cooler in a display case at a museum. So it's sort of a tongue-in-cheek relic of the good old days back in the office. There is no question that significantly more remote work is here to stay. And in the next couple of slides, we're going to first take a look at the differing perceptions of employees and employers when it comes to working from home. Then Demetra is going to take us through some tips for leading remote workers that I know you'll find very helpful. So, differing perspectives on working from home. I'm going to start first with the employees, and then I'll get to the employers. I think prior to the pandemic, employers used to think that employees would be happier working from home, but would be less productive. And given this, there was some support for work from home, but still lots of resistance, that lack of trust that work would get done. Reductions in productivity were probably the most significant. With the massive shift to work from home, it turns out that employees, while initially happier, are now not so much. However, so far productivity has been preserved or even increased in some cases. So let's take a look at what those positives and challenges are. So for employees, the positives are, all intuitive: the flexibility, the reduced commute time, increased family time, although I must say I'm too much of a good thing at times is not so good, or too much closeness can drive you crazy sometimes. Reduced stigma. There definitely was previously a stigma of those who chose to work from home, going back to that, were they being as productive, etc. So reduce stigma. But on the challenges side, people really miss their colleagues. The opportunity to collaborate, that water cooler, the lunchroom, the hallway, the water cooler, whatever, and on-the-job learning. Increased isolation and stress. Demetra mentioned earlier the increasing incidence of mental health, huge. For some, it's not necessarily conducive to work from home, particularly with kids also not being in school. That will change. We'll see in the fall, kids hopefully returning to some normal rhythm. But for others, particularly women, remember I said at the outset, there are increasing numbers of women in the workforce. For women, sometimes being at home with their families is not a good thing. And there's been increasing incidents of domestic violence in Canada. Just to give you one stat, Vancouver's Battered Women's Support Services says it has seen a 300% increase in calls to its helpline since the pandemic started. So definitely some challenges. On the employer side, the positives are from the employer's perspective themselves, their increased acceptance that it's doable. They've seen it work. They flipped a switch and it worked. Huge real estate savings. I mean, typically real estate associated with an employee in the office can be anywhere, fully loaded, 20 to 30% in addition to that employee's salary. So those are big savings. The productivity is holding, like I said. And the other thing is that they've got, employers have increased access to less mobile talent, and we'll see down the road, talent in different geographies, potentially. The challenges, though, greater risk of disengaged employees, and Demetra is going to speak to that important need for connectivity. Leaders' effectiveness in engaging and motivating a remote workforce. We didn't plan for this. We didn't plan for this massive shift. And leaders need to learn effective ways to engage and motivate their team members. And the flip side, or we saw this negative as well too, reduce collaboration and on-the-job learning. So a number of positives and challenges that companies need to be taking into account. So Demetra, I'm going to turn it over to you. Hang on a second. I think I need to go in here. Yeah. Strategies for leading remote workers.
Perfect. Thank you, Hazel. With a permanent shift to significant remote work on the horizon, employers need sustainable solutions when it comes to leading their workforce. Effective and frequent communication is key. Whenever possible, opt for virtual face-to-face meetings. This will reduce instances of miscommunication. It's also important to prepare well for your virtual meetings by doing a bulk of the work ahead of time. Many of us are suffering from Zoom fatigue lately, so it's advisable to take frequent breaks. And when on conference calls, allocate more time in the event of tech issues. Employers are also advised to establish clear work from home guidelines, as well as clear daily and weekly objectives. Over-communicate and ensure that employees have an opportunity to ask questions. Maintaining corporate culture while working from home can be achieved by sharing good news and success stories with your employees. Implementing a weekly social hour is a great way to engage your staff. Overall, working from home is much easier and more productive when your Wi-Fi works. So ensuring frequent check-ins with your IT team is a must. Hazel will now discuss learning and reskilling in the new normal. Over to you, Hazel.
Thanks, Demetra. And apologies, folks, when we did this slide, the alignment of the blocks was better. Seeing it now on screen, I see that it was not as intended. So turning to learning and reskilling, I got to be in the slide. Just bear with me a second. Like I said earlier, pre-pandemic, learning, reskilling, relevance of employees, would they have jobs in this fourth industrial revolution? Employers were facing skills gaps to the extent that employers were transforming how things got done. They needed new skills and they were facing skills gaps. Now, in the midst of and post-pandemic, business models may be undergoing significant changes, again, likely requiring different skills. So it's really important that organizations build a skills-based work plan to identify the learning and reskilling needs to support. And just on this slide, which I'll just build quickly, we're going to touch upon and then show some examples. So how to build a skills-based work plan. One must always start with your strategy. And I know I said earlier that you're not necessarily going to know what your long-term strat plan is, but you're going to have some sense of how your business model needs to be changing in light of the pandemic for your organization to respond accordingly and have the best chance of success going forward. So starting with strategy and your business model, what then are the key skills required to support those changes? What do we need to excel at to have success in executing on our strategy and implementing our new business models? What gaps exist between those key skills and what's already available in our workforce? Having determined those gaps, do we build them or do we buy them? And once you land on that, you need to prioritize, because you don't necessarily, there will be some skills that will be more important than others. Prioritize, develop a learning plan to deliver those skills or to go out and acquire them, implement, test, learn, pivot. So I want to just provide you with some examples, and you'll have the PDF so you can look at these more closely. But more remote work, it's a given that that's going to be the case. And as I said earlier, leaders need to understand what effective leadership of remote teams entails. So that's just one example. More e-commerce, everybody's doing that. That will be an important component to people's new business models. There's a certain set of skills that are needed there. Already we had in play more digital and AI, data analytics, distilling and communicating insights, etc. Massive changes in supply chain. What will that now entail? For example, onshoring of roles and skills that were previously offshored or outsourced. So lots that needs to be considered to understand what your organization needs to excel at to be to have the greatest success in implementing your strategy. So the last slide, this is the second to last slide before we get to questions. I'm going to turn it over to David to talk about the importance of culture.
Thank you, Hazel, and I very much appreciate the terrific content we've had so far. I want to touch on some of the topics that we talked about in our previous webinars as well, with culture really at the core. It's so critical to have a positive culture. And similar to what Hazel said before about leadership, where great leadership and frankly poor leadership show up even stronger in a time of pandemic, so do culture issues as well. And they're really at the core of an organization. And we've spoken a number of times about the need for trust within an organization, particularly when you're no longer face-to-face with individuals, clients, suppliers, and fellow employees and associates. And so it's really critical that culture is built up within the organization and aligned with the purpose, mission, and values of the organization. For our organization, the Poirier Group, our values are learning, serving, excellence, and integrity, and we embrace those in every way and practice them and give feedback on those things to one another every single day. And so it's not just about having signs on the wall with pretty pictures and waterfalls and a few great words. It's about really instilling that culture within the organization, holding people accountable to it and to growing it, but also nurturing it along in the behaviors that the leaders have within the organization. And the culture is certainly tested in a lot of ways during the pandemic, but it also shows that a great culture can do very well through a pandemic. And we've seen that through a number of organizations that have stood up and done, quote, the right thing in moments of truth during this pandemic. Given the need for the increase in speed of change within organizations, not just during this time, but in coming out of this time and facing the new world, with the example of, digitizing companies and some of the work that's been done so quickly in a matter of weeks versus years, it's really going to be critical to make sure that you can move at the speed of trust and have that driven by the culture within the organization. So you keep your employees engaged. You make sure that everybody's aligned to the strategy, that you can differentiate your organization not just through the products and services it has, but through the culture that it has, so you can attract the best and the brightest, and frankly, attract the best clients as well. And have that focus on connection and communication with one another to reinforce trust within the organization, with your suppliers, with your customers, with your employees, and with your stakeholders and shareholders as well. And so it's really critical to keep coming back to this, not just get focused on execute, but do it in the context of the purpose and mission and values of your organization, and keep that culture alive for everybody. Hazel, anything further to add on that?
No, that was well said. And one of the things that I meant to mention earlier when we were talking about remote work, and you raised it, David, in your remarks just now, was, a lot of organizations are saying, oh, we like this remote work stuff. We're going to go to this permanently. It seems to be working. We're seeing productivity hold, and oh yeah, we're saving lots of money. In many ways, however, the reason it's been working is because there were relationships that were formed in person, in office settings, or settings that we, were more used to pre-pandemic. And so we are trading on that trust. We are trading on our knowing our colleagues well and what they're like. And but we've been almost 3 months? I kind of lost track of time. We've been 3 months, and it's going to be many months to come. And so by now we're probably on the fumes, operating on the fumes of those relationship and that trust that was there before. The other thing is that remote work, and maybe it's unusual now, and as as the economy starts to reopen and people get those opportunities to reconnect outside of work, right now people haven't been able to fill the void of that desire for connection by going out with family and friends if those individuals are not already in their bubbles, so to speak. So I just wanted to highlight trust is really, really important. And so organizations, as they think about new business models and new ways to organize their workforce and the physical space, whether that's working from home or working in the office, need to be thinking about how do you cultivate, how do we replenish trust, because that bank account is being depleted. So I want to move to the last slide before we open it up for questions, and we're kind of getting up there. So I'll just build this whole thing. And we've been talking about this: actions speak louder than words. And we've been talking about trust and how there's a lot of eyes on leaders at this time, going back to that quote from Abraham Lincoln. And we hope that over this conversation over the last hour or 40 something minutes, we've highlighted for you the importance of how your leaders are showing up, how employee needs are met, and how company culture is demonstrated. And a question to ask yourself is, how will your organization show up for your people in this new normal? So with that, David, we should go to questions. And
yes.
I'm in control, but Maggie, I'm assuming you're the one
okay.
who has the question.
I have the questions coming in through me, so we're all right. Hazel, why don't I give you this first one, and Demi, you can comment as well. In your opinion, what skills would you say will be important for younger generations to acquire moving forward?
That's a really good question. And actually, to be honest with you, I think the younger generation is already ahead of those of us, David. You and I would be from the same generation. Those of us, right? If I think about my kids, I have 21-year-old twins. They're digital, they're innovative, they're curious, they take risks, they're open to that learning. So it's all of those things that are really critical in a time of massive change. Those are the skills that I think are going to serve people from any generation, but in particular, young people.
I completely agree with Hazel. Flexibility is a key skill, and really the new generation is leading in this, because right now the younger generation is my IT team at home. So they're better equipped than we are.
Absolutely. Yeah. Here's another one. I want to get in one more question anyway. How do you combat virtual fatigue, where employees might be resistant to virtual meetups and social hours?
That's a good one. I must say that I've turned down or just ignored requests for Zoom cocktail parties, because when you're spending so much time and it requires extra energy to participate in virtual meetings, so much more effort to try and read signals, body language, discern tone of voice. Not everything requires a meetings. Like, you know, forget virtual meetings. If you just go back to our setting that we had, you know, pre-pandemic, we already had too many meetings in the workplace, right? And people were being challenged to really be reflective of, did it require a meeting? How many people needed to be at the meeting? What was the purpose of the meeting? All of that still holds true, if not more so than before. So I think people need to be respectful of people's time and only have those meetings when necessary. I mean, a lot of times I just like having a phone call now, because then I don't have to worry about, you know, getting my setup. I don't have to worry about all the background noise. I don't have to, you know, get ready, so to speak, right?
Or worry about your haircut.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we've also encouraged people to actually change the rooms that they're sitting in. Some don't have too many options on those rooms, but change the rooms of the location that they're sitting in for those meetings, just to give them a little different environment. We do have to wrap up now. I want to thank you all very much for joining us for this. We do have more questions coming in, and we'll make sure through Maggie Bolt that we do respond to those questions that you have. We do want you to keep in touch with us, and we encourage you to follow us on LinkedIn. And I want to thank very much both Hazel and Demetra for joining us for a very insightful and very rich webinar today, and wish you all safety and health going forward. Have a great week.
Thanks, David.